Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I apologize for the delay. I was on the 6 train, and then it stopped in the middle of the platform. I don't know if anybody else had that problem, but then they told us get out and walk to the 7 train, which was about 20 blocks away. And then every Uber that I tried to call canceled on me a minute before. I'm pretty sure it's because I'm Muslim, and nobody wanted to help me out, given that I was trying to come here tonight. But alhamdulillah, we were able to make it and get things started. I've had the privilege of reading parts of Asma's book. It's a really amazing read. I definitely recommend everybody grabbing a copy and also encouraging your friends to get it. Beyond just the substance and content of the text, I think just the manner in which it's written really makes it easy to digest. So many different facets of the complex issue that we're going to try to unpack a little bit tonight. So Asma, I was hoping to start off, you could tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write the book, and what is the title really referring to when it says that Islam is not a religion? Are there actually people who feel that Islam is in fact not a religion? And if they do think that, what do they believe it to be?
Well, first, thank you, Khalid. I just call him Khalid, mostly because I'm obsessed with Khalid right now, the singer. But Khalid.
It's like DJ Khalid.
And plus, because... So, okay, I'm going to try to remember that. So, Imam Khalid, thank you for being here. And also for all of you guys for coming out and beating the heat wave to be here. So to give you some background who I am, I am a lawyer by training, and I've been doing religious liberty litigation and other forms of advocacy for about a decade now, including some really controversial, crazy cases that we can get into a little bit later, even at the U.S. Supreme Court. And the sort of the theme and sort of the principle that runs throughout my work is that religious freedom belongs to everyone, regardless of their politics, regardless of whether or not I understand the particular belief or religious practice at issue. And that could be conservative issues, it could be, or things that are considered conservative religious liberty claims or progressive religious liberty claims. And so it's interesting to kind of be in a place where I'm enforcing and really kind of implementing this coherence, which I think is rooted in a sort of moral integrity. And then to find that many of the same people in this space are not extending that to American Muslims. And I saw this probably on clearest display in a 2010 case in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, that sort of my firm got involved at the sort of federal court case that got filed later, but there was a chancery court case in which the community there wanted to build a mosque, and so the county approved the building plans. They were just about to move forward, and this was published in the local newspaper. And this group of local residents decided that this was not going to stand. And so they actually brought a case challenging the county approval. And the argument that was made in court and was allowed to go on for 6 days was that Islam is not a religion. It is instead a dangerous political ideology. And therefore, American Muslims do not get access to rights under the First Amendment. An actual claim, to the point where the 2010 Department of Justice had to file a brief in Chancery Court, probably the first time I'd ever done that, making the remarkable argument that Islam is a religion. And since then, unfortunately, at the time I was like, wow, this is so crazy, but, maybe it's kind of fringe. But unfortunately, since then, increasingly people in prominent positions, very influential, are repeating that claim.
In a course that I teach at New York University, we actually show a documentary on the Murfreesboro case that I think Soledad O'Brien put together in a series on CNN. It's called Unwelcome, and then this one's called The Muslims Next Door. And my students, when they watch it and they're hearing the legal counsel who is trying to prove that Islam is not a religion, give the arguments and kind of put forward facts, you just hear all kinds of exasperated sounds as they're watching, trying to understand how could somebody actually argue this claim. But the fact is there are people who are doing this. And I think fundamentally the purpose and objectives tend to get lost because it seems quite comical at times, especially when you're watching it on a video or you're trying to read articles. What do you think the purpose is of this, and where do you feel like it traces its roots to?
So, I mean, if in terms of the roots, we can go pretty far back. But in terms of the book, I start the narrative in the last 10 years or so. And 9/11 was kind of a turning point in which obviously American Muslims came under the microscope. But for a while, post 9/11, things weren't that bad, right? We had a president who kept emphasizing the sort of like the peacefulness of Islam and many Muslims and distinguishing that. But unfortunately, it was actually the ground zero, quote unquote, ground zero mosque debacle that happened, of course, right close to here, that started this huge conversation about really just about American Muslims and really brought into question this right to build houses of worship, which is like a pretty base fundamental right that all people of faith have. And as that craziness, I mean, as we know, that was like this big question that came up, right? Like some people are like, they have the right to build it, but is it really right? And then some people are actually arguing that Muslims don't actually have the legal right to build a house of worship. And what few people know is that sort of on the heels of that controversy was this huge sort of wave of anti-mosque protests that continue to this day. I mean, there are mosques now that are in the process of either being built or expanding or something that requires a county approval, and they're just dealing with so much local opposition. It's pretty arduous, and they're having to incur like hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. But this idea of Islam is not a religion. Why is it being said? I mean, the obvious one in terms of the direct reason, it's because it's the way to deprive. So actually argue that Muslims don't have access to this fundamental human right to religious freedom. Their idea is like, well, religious freedom is only for religion, so let's just say it's not a religion, right? And then push that line of argument. And of course, what I point out in the book is that when you start to say that certain humans don't have access to human rights, you're essentially calling into question the very humanity of these people. And then there's been these interesting think tanks that have popped up, often in sort of response to actual think tanks. There's like these pseudo think tanks. And so, for instance, there's one called the Center for the Study of Political Islam. And they purport to have gone through the entire sort of, Quran and Hadiths and numbered which ones they would categorize as religion. Of course, their idea what religion is and what they categorize as political. And they have determined on the basis of this quote unquote statistical analysis that only 16% of Islam is a religion. And you would think that's, again, crazy. But Tony Perkins, who currently heads up the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, has made precisely that claim. And so, again, it goes to this question of, like, who is this influencing and what positions of power are they in?
Yeah, I mean, when the Ground Zero Mosque incident was happening here, our center at NYU was doing some collaborative program with them in Ramadan. It was crazy, I think. The story was literally on the front page of the news every day for about 5 or 6 months straight. And for any media cycle to exist that long just on any one narrative, and not just even on the back end of something, but if you were walking through the streets of Manhattan, you would see that the experiences of people in New York, especially in downtown Manhattan, were drastically different than what the media was kind of portraying as the image of this kind of, I don't even know what you would call it, but a glory house of, kind of domination of Islam and, the confines of the World Trade Center. And I feel like the narrative that gets imposed upon us quite often does synergize itself in a lot of dynamics that we see numerous minority populations facing currently in this country and have faced since the country was founded. To me, a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment is just symptomatic of a deeply entrenched anti-blackness that the country is found upon. Do you feel like the things that Muslims are facing these days, in terms of discrimination of any kind, inclusive of what you're writing about in the book, are things that other minority groups are facing or have faced similarly?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I do in the book is I sort of trace the eerie familiarity of this claim that Islam is not a religion in terms of the arguments that were made against other religious groups, right? And so I look at, for instance, anti-Catholic animus in the 19th century, and very similar claims that Catholics had allegiance to a foreign power, in that case, the Pope. Something that we saw, even as recently as John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. And to some extent, I kind of pointed out even some of the questioning happening now of traditional Catholic believers. For instance, I would actually point out that the questioning of Amy Coney Barrett and this gentleman, Brian Boucher from the Knights of Columbus, from various senators, about, we all remember, does the dogma live within you? Or I think that was and so I think I actually feel like that is kind of very much resonant to me, this idea of like you somehow cannot place your allegiance of the U.S. Constitution over your own religious beliefs. But of course, we saw it in its most extreme form in the 19th century, with Catholic churches and homes being ransacked and burned down and riots happening in the streets. We saw this in terms of anti-Jewish discrimination. We saw it happening against Mormons, the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And of course, to this day, I think a number of LDS would tell you that they continue to face some level of hostility. We definitely saw it when Mitt Romney was running for president. So yes, there's definitely this similarity. But at the same time, so sometimes when people are like, well, what do you think is going to happen? What's your sort of like outlook for the future? And a part of me is like, we've been through this and we can get through it again. But we also have to understand that there are unique factors. And I think a lot of this hostility was coming from a place where it was like the majority kind of feeling, this XYZ religious group is somehow going to threaten, for instance, the Protestant, or in your point about anti-Blackness, like the white Protestant sort of character of our country. But what's interesting to me now is that, in fact, because of demographic changes, that isn't something just sort of like a fantastical fear, but it's actually like there's like kind of like the numbers that are further driving this deep sort of fear and anxiety. And so I think, of course, that and like the rise of sort of global terrorism, the use of social media, which has definitely exacerbated things. I think we have unique factors. And of course, anybody reading the news knows that religious freedom is hopelessly politicized these days, often written about and talked about with scare quotes around it, right? Everybody's like, is that just a cover for anti-LGBT discrimination, right? So when you also have so much like distrust and sort of cynicism about religious freedom, I think that poses a unique challenge as well.
Do you think the solution to this lies in the courts, or are there other strategies that would need to be implemented, or not even either or, but kind of a both and model?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the courts are a key part of this. But, I was at a conference here a couple months ago at Cardozo, to law school, and there was these professors and lawyers sitting on the panel, and they kind of were in agreement that this isn't going to be resolved in the courts of law, right? I mean, that's definitely an important piece of it, and the book very much looks at it, because I think a lot of times we talk about Islamophobia or anti-religious minorities or anti-religious generally sentiment coming from politicians and coming from the media. And I was like, well, what about courts? I mean, where our actual, our legal rights are actually adjudicated. So I think the courts are important. And a huge reason for the book is really kind of wanting to educate people about religious freedom so that we can have greater accuracy and sort of literacy in like the concept, like what is it, right? Everybody's always sort of thinks of it and they think it has something maybe to do with religious pluralism or religious tolerance, but in fact it's a legal concept. And so I think we need greater literacy around that to help then also inform the public discourse so that it can kind of work in tandem with the courts.
So what was the audience you had in mind when you were writing the book? Because I think it's definitely a message that people need to hear. But I feel like the unfortunate reality is that today, with the great increase we have in interconnectivity through social media platforms, people tend to speak in echo chambers quite often. And when you have discourse and rhetoric that is needed to be engaged by the others, so to speak, quite often they're not even present to hear, let alone even if they were here literally, or just hearing, they wouldn't listen to it. So in kind of the situation we find ourselves in today, how do we get people to listen to this kind of message?
Yeah, so one of the things, the sort of driving forces behind framing the book that I did, other than the fact that I've spent the past decade working on religious freedom, is also understanding that religious freedom, that discourse, that language really resonates with the precise, part of this country, that the precise demographic that unfortunately a lot of this anti-Muslim hate and sentiment comes from. And so, and sometimes it's hate, sometimes it's just like a lot of misunderstanding, or people just sort of like taking, just sort of consuming the arguments that are being, handed to them by their religious or political leaders. But I know that religious freedom, like as a concept, is just like it's held very dear by so many Americans, many conservatives, especially many religious conservatives. Having worked with, for instance, members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, again, the Mormon Church, the Catholic Church, this is just like something that really resonates with people. And so I'm like, well, I don't really see that many people talking about anti-Muslim issues through the frame of religious freedom, using that language, and specifically pointing out to these folks that very specifically, in like not just sort of in broad terms, but look, if you do this, it's going to come back to bite you. So if you have no other reason to want to stop engaging in these tactics or stop supporting them, you should at least have just purely be motivated by self-interest, right? And there's like a lot of money, there's a lot of like, there's corporate churches in this country. There's a lot of real stuff that's on the table here. And I show that if once you kind of cede power to the government to determine, which groups it's going to protect, and basically decide that the majority can somehow, or some vocal majority or powerful majority, or powerful group can decide which religions get protection and which don't, that's just going to come back to bite you. Like, I mean, you could very easily be the next one.
I mean, I think if, we go back a couple of questions and we see like the check boxes of privilege are there in terms of, the white Protestant heterosexual male in this country represents every demographic of privilege that you can think of. And whether it's people in this audience or kind of more broadly what New York City looks like these days, we live in a very different part of the country where diversity is not it's not something that is uncommon. Like I could literally stand on the street corner in a turban and a long robe and people will ask me directions because I don't stick out. But as we start to move across the rest of the country, it doesn't necessarily look like that so much. And I think some of the challenges that are faced for Muslims in particular tend to not stem always under the prism of religion, but really have a lot to do with elements of race and class that have kind of plagued the country since it was founded. Do you feel like race factors into this more than at times we are really commenting on as a Muslim community? And if yes or no, how do you feel like the argument of religious freedom synergizes itself with ideas around racial discrimination as well?
Well, I mean, I do explore in the book so the role of race, right? The racialization of Muslims, for instance, and the ways that, for instance, Muslims are sort of uniformly kind of perceived as brown-skinned. Not even like the Muslims from Far East Asia, for instance, are just unless you're wearing identifiably Muslim garb, you probably won't be assumed Muslim, right? And so for that reason, you have the fact that Sikh Americans are the victims of anti-Muslim hate crimes without even being Muslim, right? So there's that racial component. There's a component of, for instance, of Black Muslims carry sort of multiple layers of discrimination. The first sort of signs in court of Islam not being considered a religion was actually in the context of the Nation of Islam, and specifically Nation of Islam prisoners when they were protesting XYZ failure to accommodate their religious request in prison. It was just, if you look at the court cases, they kind of just rejected the claims, and at play in that was really kind of this idea as Nation of Islam not being a religion, but also these sort of tropes about Black men and sort of security threats that were sort of that they were perceived to be. And so a judge was very sort of loath to want to challenge prison officials, in light of that particular conflict. So race does play into it in a number of different ways, but I think also it's like, how do you define sort of the racial component, right? So even if you're, white, if you're like, let's say a Bosniak, if you're dressed as a Muslim, that in itself can help sort of separate you out as a different quote unquote race or a different group without necessarily this being a question about skin color.
I mean, at that point you lose your whiteness, right? And you are now categorically understood to be Muslim, which in the eyes of some are, you're non-white and by extension non-American, or American rights don't necessarily apply to you in the ways that they might apply to others. I remember a while ago on a Tyra Banks show, and please don't ask why I was watching a Tyra Banks show, but when Tyra Banks was hosting a show, they were doing a exercise on race, and I think the audience had to determine whether someone was white, black, or Muslim were the category options that were given to them. And just to have those things kind of placed against each other, I think was a really interesting kind of formulation. One, of the writers of the show who suggested it, but two, just of how people kind of tend to visualize people who are Sikh American, people who might be Hindu, people who are Christian but brown-skinned, not Muslim at all. I remember at NYU in the aftermath of the presidential election where we had a lot of hate crimes in New York City. There was, 2 imams who got shot point blank in the back of the head, leaving their mosque following afternoon prayers in Queens. I attended a funeral for an elderly woman who was walking with her husband late at night one night, and he was a little asthmatic, so she was running ahead of him to get dinner ready, and then he came upon her screaming. Someone had stabbed her, and she had succumbed to the wounds. In Brooklyn here, we had 2 mothers who were strolling with babies, wearing headscarves that somebody attacked both the mothers and the children, and that was classified, as a hate crime. But these were very real experiences that I think were not at times like always felt so much by people in New York, but weren't necessarily put out there as kind of the consequences of an unchecked kind of bias and bigotry that really moves and pushes people in ways that at times we don't necessarily recognize. What kind of pushback have you gotten when you try to share some of your thoughts and ideas on this issue? I can't imagine that it's easy by any means to stand in front of some of the audiences that you have stood in front of. What's it been like for you?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about the title is it's intentionally ambiguous. And so some people see it and they're like, yeah, exactly. Like, Islam's not a religion, right? And so for instance, I open the book with my, on stage at the Museum of the Bible, and which is owned by a very conservative family, actually the family who owns the Hobby Lobby craft stores. And it was interesting because I was hosted by George Washington University, and the moderator was talking about my book. This is before the book had even come out. And there was a gentleman outside who had seen some of the flyers who had immediately kind of assumed that I was arguing the opposite of what I was arguing. And so when I got up there and it was President's Day, I was talking about like the founding ideals, of religious freedom for this country. You could just see the sense of disappointment. He was the first person, hands up, and he was just like...
You were arguing that Islam is not a religion?
Yeah.
He was excited that you were...
He was so excited. And
amazing.
then he hears my presentation, and he was like the first hand up during the Q&A, and you could just tell there was like this total look of like disappointment on his face. Like I just let him down. And there are assumptions, by the way, again, because I have worked for a law firm that has defended conservative religious claims, that I think that was part of it, why he just sort of assumed. And so it's just the media thing is always, it's like the same type of things. And at this point, it's become pretty predictable. What about Sharia? What about the oppression of women? What about XYZ? The precise sort of thing that went down that courtroom in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where, believe it or not, in a courtroom, an attorney was asking things like, do you believe that something that legitimizes having sex with a 6-year-old is a religion? I mean, these were questions being asked in a courtroom. And it's those precise sorts of, maybe in slightly less vulgar forms that I get all the time, like where people are trying to tell me that my religion is not a religion. And so one of the things I kind of lay out right in the beginning of the book is that, in advocating for religious freedom for all, like I'm not advocating for a free for all, right? And so there's these deep principles, very broad principles of protecting the rights of people of diverse faiths, but that doesn't mean that we just let anything go, right? And so because the media thing that people have a concern about is like, well, if you give freedom to Muslims, they're gonna take over America and subvert our constitution, and we won't be safe from terrorism and violence. And it's just like, well, first of all, that's not gonna happen, and I'm not trying to legitimize any sort of fears to that end. But to the end that somebody actually was trying to use sort of a loophole in religious freedom to sort of, engage in violence, the law handles that quite well. And it's in our interest to protect the robustness of that law and the equal protection of that law, because it does that job very well, which is why, we continue to be in a place where religious freedom hasn't been used in that way.
I mean, how do you cope with some of it? I can't imagine that absorbing it and then walking away, it just kind of starts and stops in the audiences. But as you leave a space that has hostility at times, or, over and over just hearing the kind of same questions, I mean, what do you do with it when you leave from a place like that?
It's kind of what I felt, again, when I heard that claim for the first time. And it was just knowing what I know about religious freedom as a human right, and the fact that when people are denying it to a particular group of people, what they're essentially doing is questioning the humanity of them. And so that was just sort of like a huge sort of reflection, and something that kind of weighs heavily, obviously, as somebody who is an American Muslim. But, in these crowds, what I think it works well. So the second person to kind of essentially accost me from the audience was, you speak so much about minority religious interests, but what about Christians? Christians are also persecuted in this country. And I'm like, yeah, I know, I've defended some of you guys. Like, I'm not going to actually challenge. I mean, I think that question of persecution can be interrogated and refuted, but but that sense of persecution is totally real. And as I said earlier, it's driving a lot of hostility. And so I find that instead of sitting there and kind of mocking them and being like, well, you're not actually, being persecuted. Your fellow conservatives are in tremendous positions of power right now. But just trying to see them as a human, and once you sort of validate their feelings of persecution and understanding that they're dealing with actual real sort of major social cultural changes that are making them feel like they're just under attack. And when you kind of just acknowledge them and just kind of like, I get it, things are happening, you feel really scared, that I think just really kind of lowers the temperature. And so I've found this even just like doing radio interviews with conservative stations. You just see like this sort of just like this flip that happens where people are just like, wait a second, we can't just put her in a box anymore, right? It's not like she's advocating for Muslims' rights or minorities' rights, as somehow superior to our rights. It's like she's just saying that for everyone. And there's like a deep principle of coherence, and we can't really contest that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mindset is such that people don't understand in order for a minority to have more rights doesn't mean that they'll have less rights. But now when you really break it down, the construction of fear, and it is like a constructed fear, is also coming in large part through that majority demographic that is synergizing government and media to be able to cast stereotype that then influences the masses in the ways that we see it, right? And I would say that this is how we move from the stratification of society being rooted in slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, that enables politicians to get up and speak in political campaigns with discourse that says black people are predators and thugs, and they are complemented with TV shows like Cops that usually have white men in blue uniforms arresting black men to reinforce those stereotypes. And then hundreds of thousands of families are disrupted when a war on drugs gets concocted, and you have innocent black people being pumped into the prison system. And so many people just sit back and watch and do nothing because they've bought into that narrative that is built on these fears that you talk about that just ignite when they now see somebody else kind of coming into a space that they're worried it means that they'll lose something. And I think that I understand, where the prism of empathy comes in, but also in large part, the onus can't be on the minority demographic to have to dismantle every aspect of what was created both externally and internally within individuals who seemingly have no qualms of, putting their own interests before the interests of others, if that makes sense. And the war on terror doesn't build itself out anyway differently, right? Where we have politicians that utilize terminologies like Islamist, jihadist, fundamentalist, terrorists TV shows like 24 and Homeland are all over television. Jack Bauer gets created as a character just months after September 11th. And I don't think they're trying to help society heal. I think they just know what's going to increase their ad revenues and what people will buy into. But fear becomes that kind of variable that becomes manipulated, and it has minority demographics then understood in this way that somehow validates and justifies the way that the majority privileged class treats them. And I think, we then see consequently things like even many of us in New York can relate to, right? Where it's just been real moments since I'm sure many people in this audience heard the devastating news around what is not happening to the perpetrators of Eric Garner's murder, for example. And how do systems like that continue to exist? And what is it really like the roles that people like us play in some of that? Not to shift gears, but I think one of the things that's remarkable with someone like yourself, and not to put you in a box, but you're clearly Muslim, and Islam is very dear to you. And I think experientially, what I've seen from many Muslim academics, authors, people who are authoritative in any way, when they seek to engage a broader public discourse on topics and ideas of Islam, they're consistently delegitimized. Like, we're told we can't speak about Islam because we're somehow unable to divorce our relationship to our faith in such a way that everything is just going to be biased. And then you see people who are of other religious traditions or of no faith at all who are given platforms, and somehow they're able to be authoritative on every part of Islam because they have more objectivity than we might. Have you met that at all? And if you have, how do you navigate that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, so in responding to both your earlier comment and this question, so first, yes, I mean, media in terms of the way that it sort of treats different issues and different sort of the crimes by certain groups of people versus others in a very disproportionate way, I think definitely feeds into sort of the cycle of misunderstanding and hate. The question about the onus, I mean, that's something that I've been kind of thinking of, and by no means am I saying that the minority kind of sort of has the burden of having to, build these bridges. But more so, I think I find that, first of all, it's not so much sort of like America writ large and like all the different complex sort of spaces of opposition, but specifically with religious freedom, the idea that I'm trying to engage with other people who think their religion is really important, and religious freedom is therefore really important. Again, that was like a huge target demographic here. Because I think religious freedom, you can't really fully like understand it sometimes unless there's some deep belief. And again, it could be a humanist belief or so on. But ultimately sort of the yearning for the metaphysical that I think you sort of, sort of like helps you connect to the deep importance of this right. And so I think in that regard, when you're looking, for instance, at conservative Christians, if you're looking at evangelicals, which the statistics point to the highest levels of Islamophobia are among evangelicals, it does help to kind of just be in a space where you can be vulnerable and understand other people as vulnerable. And I think that, in many ways, our respective religions kind of call us kind of rise above spaces of division and, again, not take on that burden, but be willing in sort of a space of like humility and generosity to reach across that divide. So on that front, in terms of like the sense of, whether or not these stories are considered authoritative and so on, the funny thing is that so far there has actually been one person in particular that has engaged me over the extended period on email already. I mean, the book just came out last week, but he's already kind of like asking a million questions and really kind of just being like, I feel like when I read your book that you're just kind of, there's like this strong sense of cognitive dissonance. And I got the same sense when I read Malala's book and all these other books, where it's just like, I don't understand how you can both state the various injustices done in the name of Islam and still be devout Muslims, right? And then over the course of this, I find that, the conversation is becoming increasingly anti-intellectual because I can give him statistics and all kinds of counter arguments, but it's just sort of like he's set in this position of, insisting that I can't possibly be right, that I'm duped. But what's interesting about him is that he himself is not a believer, and he actually thinks all religions are bad. And so I find that to be interesting, because I think in contrast to that, when I was writing this book, believe it or not, I actually had one of my my friends who works at the Heritage Foundation, probably it's like super conservative. And one of the things she kept saying when she was reading my drafts was like, bring more of your religion into it, because trust me, that's what resonates with conservatives. Religion is important to them. It informs their life. And the more you talk about the way that your religion informs your life, I think that really kind of draws people to that. And I think that her advice has borne fruit. Like I see that when I go on these radio shows and in these fora, when I start talking about, for instance, my late father, and his sort of like superhuman, faith in the divine, and just sort of like the way that was a constant force in his life, and the way that that's impacted me, I see that move people. And so I think that, again, it just depends on like who the people are we're engaging, and religion in that sense can be a really sort of powerful space for storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because I don't think people really fit into these boxes of liberal and conservative as neatly as we would like to assume people fit into. I mean, in my experiences, whether it's with local houses of worship or sitting down with people who are the heads of religious communities that exist on global levels, I've sat down in audiences where I'm the only Muslim, not just in the space, but entire communities have ever met for the first time in their lives. And quite often at the end of it, I'll be met with this idea of, we didn't know that you believe the things that you believe, meaning just the fundamental practice of your faith and theology and how your personal narrative intertwines within it. And I'll push back on them a little bit, and I'll say, I think what you're really asking me is, like, why do we dislike you so much? Because it's not hard for them to understand the religious connection, right? Because Islam has a concept of a God the way other religions have a concept of a God. We have holidays, we have prayer, we have practice. And I think where it starts to then become an opening is pushing through the prism of that personal narrative and anecdotal experience, this idea that, maybe it doesn't have to do with religion that you have animosity towards me, and maybe it has to do with the same reasons that everybody else faces discrimination in this country, and it has to do a lot with just principles of race and class, and where there's complexity in how we perceive the other, at times through some of the systems that are built around supremacy and patriarchy and this kind of overt capitalistic desire that seems to never be unsatiated, that allows for us to just continue to step on people in the ways that we step on them, unfortunately. And, I think it becomes sometimes hard to talk about, but I know I'm grateful that we have people like yourself who are willing to kind of step out of the conventional role that many people might, and go out and be in these communities that at times, will seem to be receptive. At times they might seem to be pandering or patronizing, or, they might be quite hostile, but, you're still going and speaking on behalf of many of us. And, it is making a difference, that, God willing, is going to be a source of real change, that we all, I think, can agree is much needed in the societies that we live in. I know that we had kind of a time constraint that I wanted to be mindful of, but I didn't know if we wanted to open up for questions, maybe for a little bit to the audience to ask. If anybody has questions, comments. Yeah, go ahead.
I have several points because I am a beneficiary of the Jesuit education.
Amazing.
Where at my university, everyone, regardless of their individual religion or belief, had to do 2 semesters of theology and 2 semesters of philosophy, and that was not negotiable. And so I've been taught to think about some of these issues. Now, as a attorney, from a great law school specializing in religious liberty, I just have a question for you, because I'm not an attorney. In terms of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion. I've often wondered about the issue of abortion, which is such a contentious issue in America, and it gets back to the definition of a fetus as a human being from the moment of conception. And I've wondered how, regardless of what one believes, one believes in this, one does not believe in that. That's a very personal decision. But acting upon it in a way that making law on the basis for all citizens, my understanding of the plain text of Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion, deciding that a human being is a fetus is a fully human being from the moment of conception, is essentially an establishment of religion. And how can that be legislated into American law? Why does that not violate the First Amendment? I have a few other questions, but maybe I'll start with that, and because other people will have questions also.
Well, I mean, that was, I think, the precise argument recently made by a columnist in the New York Times, and I saw sort of like the outcry among a number of sort of conservative and center-right groups on Twitter to her article. But I think the simple answer, just because you can actually make a secular argument for it, I think the way that it is argued, even though many people think of it as sort of a religious definition of the beginning of life, is simply because you can just take the religion part out and then come up with like a secular sort of reasoning as to why we have to protect life at that point, right? I mean, it's like the type of thing, for instance,
I've never seen any secular argument for that. That scientists will say a fetus is a fetus, and at the point at which a fetus becomes a human being, that gets into the realm of religion, of how one thinks, conceptualizes a fetus.
Well, I think that depends on your sort of definition of humanity, right? Like you can determine the heartbeat at 6 weeks. And so a number of people might, sort of purely on a biological basis say that because that heartbeat is detectable, that is the point at which perhaps we should be considering this to be, or the fact that there's a potential for a fully formed human at that point. Simply said, I mean, a lot of these establishment cases, I mean, as far as I know, I don't think that in the court of, I mean, again, I don't really delve into the question of religion of abortion. But I don't know that there's ever been a legal argument sort of making that point. And obviously it's ripe now with the recent passages of restrictive laws in Alabama and Georgia and elsewhere. And obviously with the intention, I mean, those laws were passed to sort of, again, challenge Roe v. Wade. And if it ever gets up to that point, which a lot of scholars think that's not likely to happen, at least not anytime soon. But of course, we will be able to see at that point whether or not that sort of argument holds water. But honestly, I mean, even beyond the question of abortion, there's questions like the Bladensburg Peace Cross case that was recently decided by the Supreme Court as to whether or not a 40-foot cross, in the middle of this intersection, this roundabout in Maryland, is something that violates the Establishment Clause. And even in that case, I mean, this is like a giant cross. The court said, and the court said that it holds secular meaning and that it was erected as a secular sort of monument to the sacrifices of these soldiers. And so I think that if you can say there's a secularity to a large cross, it's probably, I mean, I'd imagine that there would be this argument that there is a secular rationale for, deciding at which point life begins.
In the back.
Yeah, I have sort of like an adjacent question, but I'll turn it a little differently. So I'm curious, as someone who's thought a lot about rights to religious freedom, how do you kind of think and talk about when rights to religious freedom bump up against other human rights, like access to healthcare? And I don't mean specifically just abortion, but like a pharmacist who doesn't give out certain medications because it's against his or her religious beliefs. I'm just curious kind of how you like think and talk about those issues.
Yeah. So it's the way that I talk about it is by saying that what is the narrow issue, right? Because a lot of times these things are framed as denying women their rights or denying access to healthcare, et cetera, or blatant discrimination against LGBT individuals or couples. When it comes to the specific legal conflict, it's often way more narrow than that. For instance, there was a case that my firm handled involving the exact fact pattern that you brought up, involving a pharmacist in the state of Washington who did not want to dispense contraception because it was in violation of her religious beliefs, specifically the morning after and the week after pill, which she considered an abortifacient, right? The equivalent of, again, it's going back to this question about when life begins. For some people, it begins pretty much immediately, right, at conception. And so we lost that case, and we were representing the Catholic pharmacist in that case. And so, but again, but one of the key questions there was, in some way, does this limit access to contraception? If it limits access, if it poses any sort of significant inconvenience on the customer, then a lot of these religious conservatives would actually agree that the religious claimant loses in that case, right? Because the standard is, has there been a substantial burden on a religious practice? And if it has, then the government has to show there's a compelling interest, right? And that's a legitimate compelling interest, right? You have just stopped a person from accessing the drug. And you have imposed this inconvenience on this person. But however, if there's a pharmacy just like a couple blocks down where they can get it, then you have less of a chance of actually succeeding on that part of the test. So I don't know if that was too legalese, but I would in general be to say that the extent possible, if it is a sincerely held belief, and if there is a way, again, to serve the other party in the case, then I would say that we should try our best to accommodate that particular religious concern. Well, in that particular context, access is a huge issue. In each case, again, it's like, what is the government interest, and is there another way to satisfy that interest, or not? And when it's or not, then the religious claimant loses. That's just the test. But if there is, it's called the least restrictive means part of the test. Like, if there's a better way to solve this problem without restricting religious practice, the government is required to take that other better way. And honestly, that's what came up with the Hobby Lobby case, the U.S. Supreme Court. It was quite simply the court, it was portrayed as like this horrible sort of war on women, but all the court was saying was, hey, government, you already provided an accommodation to the nonprofits, so now you've already figured out there's a better way to satisfy these interests, just apply to this too. And it was just a very legal question and analysis, application of the legal test. Yes.
Hi guys. Quick question. Inside of the United States, we've had kind of a lot of conversations around the context of Sharia law, right, and how that fits into what people understand, what people practice, that sort of thing. So Jews are allowed to utilize Talmudic law inside of the divorce cases, their marriage cases, how they slaughter their meat, that sort of thing. Could you kind of unpack the contextualization of where Sharia is, and unpack maybe where a lot of fear mongering is, and how does it reconcile that?
So that's like a huge question, and I have an entire chapter. Chapter 5 is dedicated to that. So that's the full unpacking there. But I do talk about the fact that a lot of the fear mongering, as you note, and it's very strategic and heavily funded. The Center for American Progress has identified the millions upon millions of dollars that go to fund these full-time anti-Muslim agitators who have decided that they're going to turn Sharia into this bogeyman, right? Like this huge sort of swamp creature that's going to come out and sort of eat us all alive. And so one of the things they do, for instance, is they say that it's oppressive of women. But the actual reality of how Sharia, or more specifically, it's called fiqh, which is the actual jurisprudence, works in the American context is exactly as you mentioned. It's in the access to religious arbitration, just as many Orthodox Jews or conservative Christians make use of. And the important point of that, part of that, is the fact that you actually don't just get to go and like arbitrate these matters and then go and like implement the decision. In fact, in order for the decision to be enforced, a secular civil court has to review it and make sure that it satisfies American public policy and sort of various other sort of procedural and substantive fairness. And so it's not what the scary, crazy thing that it's made out to. It's actually very much constrained because of the very, very specific legal review process that it goes through. So even if it was some sort of crazy swamp creature, it is well constrained by our legal framework. And the other point I make is, a couple of different points. I say, hey, all these different people who are advocating for this don't realize that in advocating for it in the places where these things have actually passed, they've actually served to weaken the American legal framework as opposed to in any way strengthen it, right? So the people sort of who support this think, well, we need to somehow protect our courts and protect our law and make it stronger. But in actuality, like, they make it less complicated and less protective of vulnerable groups. And so I talk about, it's sort of trumpeted as protecting women's rights, but in actuality, it's actually been used to deny, for instance, alimony agreements and prenuptial agreements because it was considered that this was informed by Sharia. The other point I make is that when you look at some of the way that these things are talked about, there's one particular exchange that I sort of transcribed for the reader, and it's like Rex Duncan, the Oklahoma legislator who was in charge of getting the anti-Sharia ballot initiative started in Oklahoma, and he's on MSNBC, and he's just kind of talking about Sharia as a threat, but it's because the liberal judges are going to use it to change our legal framework. And it was just he just kept kind of going back and forth between Sharia and liberals. And I was just like, what's going on here? There's this weird sort of melding of these concerns. And I think that, that's something that I then discussed later on in the book as to how these things are intricately connected. That it's not just about Muslims as sort of the singular threat, but this idea that it's all part and parcel of the liberal sort of makeover of America and American culture and American values. And these sorts of fears that we've been talking about, these sort of changing demographics of America becoming less Christian, right? Where we're essentially a post-Christian nation. But they're actually coupled with concerns of the Islamization of America. And it's the idea there, again, is that liberal judges, liberal figures in elite media, liberals in the halls of power. I mean, you hear this stuff all the time among conservatives. They're sort of taking over. They sort of are outsized in influence, and they're propping up Muslims. And they love Islam, but they hate Christianity. So I see that there's a number of different strains of things that are happening here.
Some of my high school friends, literally, I just dodged it. I was hanging out. The cops used to come every day and basically just get the kids to go back home because there's too many high schools in the area. So it's just to avoid any fights with other schools. So I literally just left, and then what was soon to be my brother-in-law, 16 years old in high school, literally cops came and searched his bag. Back when stop and frisk was very widespread, and they literally just told him, "Oh, do you have a bomb in that bag?" It's something that we carry like a cell phone or something, So in one case, yes, it's you rise above it, our prophet and those who were before us, they went through challenges, and at the same time, when it starts becoming policy, what do you feel is the most effective way into challenging some of these policies that are they're trying to make against religion, Islam, liberalism, and whatnot?
Right, and definitely, if you want to answer as well, but that's exactly kind of the point at which the book sort of begins to grapple with this issue, right? The point where it's we've heard a lot about what's going on in media and politics, and I do lay that out in my early chapters, just kind of set the stage. But it's really that's the concern, right? The point at which it's being translated into policy, whether it be these anti-Sharia laws that have now been proposed in 43 states, 217 bills to date. And people thought this was an old thing, but the last one was actually proposed in 2018. So, policy, whether it be these court cases or the actual sort of protests that are happening outside of courts dealing with the construction of mosques. And in all of those cases, it's my response there is yes, there has to be a robust understanding of our rights, and the starting point there is really also to educate people about what these rights are, and there needs to be an insistence and a demand on sort of enforcing those rights in an equal way. So when I was talking about kind of making peace, it was more so also taking the moment to say what are the drivers of this hate, and where can we kind of work with them, sort of more as a sort of a preemptive measure. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally understanding and recognize how power works and how to build it and create it. If we were to break down just fundamental components of power, having kind of control of kind of state-sanctioned units of violence is a source of power, right? You can control military, law enforcement, etc. It becomes a source of power for you. Wealth is a source of power. What society deems to be culturally normative, can become a source of power. And I think what's in the favor of most minorities is that numbers can also be a source of power. And I think to be able to break down things on a policy level necessitates understanding, especially in this country, that everything doesn't exist like on a national level, but many things function on a local level. And where and how you can build coalitions. Like we sit in a diverse group of people here right now, and it's very unique individuals that are able to have messages and words that can bring together people that come from diverse backgrounds, right? It's not ethnocentricity that's in the room. There's not homogeneity around most of the things that become variables for our convening, but people are here because they're being called to values, and values can kind of transcend socially constructed differences. And so when you have numbers, you can start to impact certain things in certain ways. Like in New York City, in the next election cycle, I don't even know like how many city council seats are going to be vacant, for example, right? Yeah, like half of them, are going to be vacant. There's going to be a ton of other like offices that are going to be open. To live in silos or to only speak within oneself does not necessarily enable individuals to kind of push back against the majority, because strategically, organized evil will always triumph over disorganized righteousness. And a way to leverage it is by segmenting and separating demographics that if they came together, they could really do a lot. And so if you had all the kids who went to all the schools in this area say that, we were sick of the cops bugging us when we were in high school, we're going to all kind of block vote for the next city council representative from this area and ensure that, they're going to get rid of the remnants of stop and frisk in totality and push for implicit bias training of law enforcement in New York City and do all kinds of different things that they do have the power to do when numbers become the variable and the factor. I think other things that come into play are how do individual communities build out the systems and institutions that are needed to dismantle like other institutions. I used to work for the NYPD. I stopped, about a year ago. I left with a rank of an inspector, and the work that I did there and elsewhere on behalf of government, State Department, Homeland Security, et cetera, the kind of people that I've been invited to share stages with, like the Pope, the Dalai Lama, and others. I've still had the FBI in my house on numerous occasions. And when I've asked them, what do you want from me? They say, you're just too good to be true. Know that we're watching you. Getting on and off of planes is not a fun experience. And being detained, profiled, surveilled, I could tell you in deep detail. And so I think the second component to it is that, if you let somebody shackle your physical, it's one thing, but the minute that they take control of your mental and your heart, you've given them complete control over you. And the ability to be able to move forward with a recognition that things can change, and how we change them is by using the best of ourselves and not kind of succumbing internally to external confines, I think can help to push back against some of the systematic and structural racisms that we see surrounding us. I think if you're in New York or just anywhere, you should vote, and you shouldn't leave your vote behind at any level. If you know somebody who's good, you encourage them to get involved at local levels, especially. We can start to influence what New York looks like for minority demographics. We can then start to replicate that in different parts of the country. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I think my wife would probably first kick me in the face, and then she would come and kick you in the face if I even brought that idea up to her. But feel free to see how that goes if you try to let her know. Yeah. I think we're gonna wrap up here, but Asma is gonna be around to, or not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm here to sign books.
People want to
if you
sign,
want
get a
that.
book signed. Definitely get a copy of the book. It's an amazing read. Get two and give one to a friend. And you can get it online right now on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Asma also has her own. Or right. No. Buy it here and buy a lot here. And then when you leave, tell people they can still buy it too. And are you going to be speaking in the area anywhere else?
No, I was on the John Fugelsang show this afternoon, and so hopefully there'll be like a recording available of that.
Where did you speak this afternoon?
John Fugelsang on a Sirius XM, but I am back and forth. I'm sure I'll be back in New York City pretty soon.
Where are you based?
I'm based in DC. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you guys for coming
So if
out.
everyone can just join me in giving her a quick round of applause as we wrap up. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here tonight. Hopefully come back again soon. Thanks.